Hello, this is Dennis Doverspike, and this is a short lecture or PowerPoint presentation on the history of testing up till about 1990 when we switched to really computerized testing. So I take it up to about 1990. Quick introduction. Again, my name is Dennis Doverspike. I've been a professor of psychology for about 40 years and been a consultant for about 40 years. Okay, so brief history. Again, when most people think about testing, they think about the Stanford Binet, maybe around the year 1900, tests being introduced. But tests were actually introduced, testing and tests were introduced a long time before. As a matter of fact, we can go to about 2200 before the Common Era, when the Chinese used testing in civil service examinations. This continued really up till about 1905. And these exams were not only used for government jobs, but also for candidates for public office. And the exams were sort of a mix of written, oral, and even work samples. And then around 1800, the British East India Company introduced testing, especially for employment to the West. In terms of the early Western approach, so we can go back even further, about 1100 Common Era, we see the use of work samples for masters, for individuals who had been apprentices in some occupation or skill and wanted to show that they had mastered that area. And we also saw the use of examinations, especially oral exams or oral tests at universities. These were used not only with students, but also to select or determine who could be a professor. So sort of summarizing, especially as far as the West is concerned, uh, around 1700 to 1800, the West took note of the Chinese approaches and began the use of tests in public sector employment testing. 1791, France introduced an early civil service exam. And around the same time, also Jesuit and German universities were starting to use more traditional types of tests rather than oral exams at the university or college level. 1855, in the United Kingdom, we see the emergence of civil service exams, the use of employment exams for selection into Her Majesty's civil service. And these were really an early intelligence test. So even before Binet, in the 1800s, we had intelligence tests in the West used for employment purposes. Of course, this also came over to the United States. Public sector testing in the United States started around 1850. Between 1850 and 1900, a number of US government agencies started to use various kinds of tests. These were sort of combinations of intelligence tests with knowledge, achievement, ability, attribute tests. And what really impacted testing as well as selection in the public sector was the assassination of President Garfield in 1881. President Garfield was shot by a disgruntled job applicant, and this led to civil service reform, including the Pendleton Act of 1883. So the United States Civil Service, in terms of testing, they started requiring competitive exams. A competitive exam, these competitive exams were very similar to general knowledge or IQ tests. They were seen as advancing diversity and inclusion. Although even back then, even back in the 1850s, there were concerns about test security. From about 1850 on, private companies in the United States started using employment tests for selection. Of course, some other history, 1800s, during the 1800s, scientists started arguing for and pressing for the notion that science must have a quantitative basis, that science must be based on measurement. Of course, this created some problems for the emerging science of psychology as to whether it was measurement-based or not. 1869, Sir Francis Galton started his study of genius. 1883, Galton set up a lab where there were a number of contributions out of this lab, including twin studies, investigations of the Pearson product moment correlation, and the introduction of the idea of a normal curve. 1888, Cattell set up his laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania. 1904 is famous for Pearson and the study of correlation, that Pearson product moment correlation. And in 1904, Spearman also introduced the two-factor theory of intelligence. Of course, this is where a lot of people see tests starting. 1904, Binet and his student Simon were commissioned by the French government to develop a series of early intelligence tests. And this was tied into the notion that educators were beginning to differentiate between education and intelligence, to say the two were not the same thing. And just because you were educated did not mean you were intelligent, and just because you were intelligent did not mean you were necessarily educated. Not all intelligent people got education, so they weren't the same thing. And we also, of course, this was recognition of individual differences then in intelligence. At the same time, in psychiatry, there was a recognition that we could study and use tests to identify those individuals who at the time were seen as mentally retarded or insane. And there was a realization that mental defects did exist and could be measured. Here we already mentioned Spearman and factor analysis. 1904, 1906, Tierman brought the IQ test to the United States. In terms of history, we should also mention the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement was a movement between about 1900 and 1930s. There were debates over topics such as institutionalization and birth control, although Burt saw IQ testing as a way to increase the working class in schools in England. So in the USA, strong supporters of IQ testing were scientists who also believed that the IQ test is mainly genetic and that society should breed a superior group of people. So I should say this was supporters of the eugenics movement. So in the United States, the IQ movement sort of got tied to the eugenics movement because there were a lot of strong supporters of both who believed that IQ is mainly genetic and therefore society could breed a superior group of people. This viewpoint is generally called eugenics, although again, I certainly think it was not an approach limited to the United States. I put this slide up here. I'm not going to go through it all. This just shows the history of the influences on the development of intelligence theory and testing. This is an example from the 1916 Stanford Binet. It shows you different sample items. It probably looks a lot like the Stanford Binet would look today, or intelligence tests would look today. This is a sample from the Army Alpha. So the Army Alpha was a test developed during World War I to test applicants to the military, both those who could read and write and those who could not read and write. So there was an Army Alpha version and an Army Beta version. And again, you can see these items look much like intelligence test items would look today. One of the most famous series of tests is the Wechsler test, the WAIS test, and this is an example of one of the earlier versions, the WAIS-R, the testing kit for the WAIS-R. This is one of the famous tests from the Wechsler, the block design test. You put these blocks together to form different patterns or objects. Another famous type of intelligence test are matrix or matrices tests. This is an example of a matrix test. Okay, so we're going through our history sort of quickly, but we're still back World War I. In World War I, Arthur Otis donated his unpublished IQ test to the Army. Army psychologists, as we've already said, developed the Army Alpha and Beta test batteries. And even prior to World War I, psychologists had begun to develop tests of what might be called special aptitudes. And Woodworth, during World War I, developed the personal data sheet. This was specifically designed to be a screen for severe neuroses. Okay, so World War I introduces the idea of large-scale testing. Uh, we see the Army Alpha and Beta, early intelligence tests that could be used for military selection. And we also see probably the first personality test. Following World War I in the 1920s, we start to see the development of various kinds of standardized achievement and aptitude tests. So some of the significant developments: 1929, Strong developed a vocational test. 1939, the Wechsler intelligence tests. 1939, Cooter developed another vocational test. And during the 1930s, we see the first test scoring machines. And then during the 1940s and 50s, we see the emergence of various test publishers, the development of the MMPI, the introduction of assessment centers. So again, 1949, that's basically the end of World War II. World War II probably had a big effect on testing, and that coming out of World War I, there was the development of a testing inventory. 1947, ETS, one of the large testing firms, identified with the development of tests for entry into universities and also graduate school, came into existence. During 1955 to 1965, we see some of the first attacks on tests, although a lot of these attacks were actually on personality tests rather than intelligence testing. 1959, the ACT, the other big university, the other big testing firm associated with testing for admission to colleges, comes into existence. 1964, probably a huge year in terms of impact on testing, because 1964 was associated with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Some other history: 1969, Jensen wrote a very controversial article regarding the heritability of intelligence. 1971 is a rather famous court decision involving employment testing, Griggs versus Duke Power. We start to see some tests revised and updated. So 1974 and 1980, the WISC and WACE were updated. And in 1975, there was a law that was passed dealing with the identification and provision of special education services. So we already said that 1964 was the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Jensen wrote a very controversial article regarding to what extent intelligence was inherited. We also saw, though, the beginning of attacks on intelligence tests for racial or ethnic bias. In 1975, California declared a moratorium on educational testing using intelligence tests. And we started to see a number of court cases dealing with educational testing. Hobson v. Hansen, 1967 and 1969, said that group ability tests could not be used to track students because of the adverse impact such tests had on minority children. And probably one of the most famous court cases in at least the educational realm, Larry P. versus Wilson Riles, 1979. Judge Peckham in California ruled that intelligence tests used for the assessment of Black children for the educable mentally retarded were culturally biased. During this time, of course, there were other court cases and court decisions, some of which had the opposite ruling, that tests were not necessarily racially biased. Okay, in terms of continuing with our history and maybe bringing it to the end, 1985, the American Psychological Association, APA, released a set of testing standards, which have been continually updated. And really, probably the watershed event, which brings us to the end of our history, 1900s, the introduction of computerized tests, or tests that could be delivered by the computer, or eventually by the internet. Okay, so if we look at and say what's maybe new in testing, or new in testing at least since the 1980s, it's you could either be cynical and say nothing's really new, or you could at least say several things are new. Certainly, the computerization of testing, or the delivery of tests by the computer, by the web, has really revolutionized the way we do testing in many ways. But looking beyond that, there's probably several other things. One would be the rebirth of testing. At least in counseling psychology, at least if not in clinical psychology, in the 1980s, there was a de-emphasis on testing. And after the 1980s, we see this renewed interest and emergence of interest in testing. That was especially true of personality testing. Personality testing was almost dead in the water outside of clinical psychology right around the 1980s, in the period of the 1970s. But after the 1980s, especially because of five-factor theory, we see a rebirth of interest in personality testing. Certainly, one area where we've had a lot of disappointment is trying to find a solution to the question of adverse impact or bias in tests. Despite a huge amount of research and also intellectual effort, there's really been no solution to the issue of how do we limit or remove bias from tests, or even to what extent are tests biased. Two other issues worthy of note are the decline in use of what we call projectives or projective tests. Certainly since the 1980s, the use of projectives has fallen into disfavor. And then the decline of behaviorism. Prior to the 1970s, if I asked people in a class, or even in the 1980s or early 1990s, if you asked people in a class, did you ever run a rat? They would know what I was talking about and say, yes, of course I ran a rat. Now, if you ask students, they have no idea what you're even talking about. So the 1970s were probably the end of the behaviorist era. Behaviorism also starts to decline and have less influence, certainly less influence on testing. Now I'm going to go over a little statistics history because I think statistics and its history are relevant to testing. And I think to know about statistics, you have to, again, we have to return to the use of computers. So prior to about 1972, it was difficult to even have a handheld calculator or a calculator that was smaller than the size of a desk. 1972 to 1976 saw the introduction of handheld calculators. And the type of handheld calculator though, that today you get for free or in a cereal box or given away as a gift, probably at the time cost around $100, which was about, in that era, what you would spend for a used Volkswagen, a used VW Beetle. So calculators were very expensive. At the time, people were still using slide rules, or as I said, very large electronic calculators that could be almost as big as a whole desk. And if you did have access to a computer, running a simple t-test or correlation on a computer would take all night. You'd drop your cards off at 5 o'clock. You'd come back the next day at 10 in the morning and see if your job had run. It probably hadn't. You probably had an error. So you'd redo your cards and then resubmit it. And then it would take again all night until you receive back your results, which may tell you made another error, which you then had to correct. So I think what's relevant here is that when we think of statistics, you need to keep in mind many statistics were developed as computationally simpler methods of other statistics. They were created so they could be calculated quite easily with paper and pencil. They were created so they could be calculated in the field by a teacher, by a researcher out in the desert somewhere doing some kind of data collection. And I think, again, a lot of this explains many of our current statistics, why we have some of the statistics we have, where they came from. Why do we have 5 or 6 statistics that are the same as another statistic, but they're just computationally different? Well, it was because people were looking for ways to do things in an easy manner, especially back in the paper and pencil era. Okay, if you have any questions, you can certainly email them to me. My name's Dennis Doverspike again. You can email me at dennisdoverspike, doverspikeconsulting.com. And thank you very much, and have a great day.